Hey folks, I'm brownbear. Today's the third in a multi-part in-depth design commentary series on Banjo-Kazooie. If you missed the first two parts, I recommend you go back and watch them so you know what's happening in this one. In addition, I highly recommend you watch this from beginning to end. However, for the convenience of folks who prefer to jump around, I provided timestamps to major talking points in the description below. Last time, we unlocked Freezeezy Peak. While we walk over to our winter wonderland, it's worth noting that no matter what level we do next, we'll have to revisit it after completing the subsequent world. Gobi's Valley requires the Beak Bomb, while Freezeezy Peak requires the running shoes. This is the only instance of forced backtracking in the entire game, and I sometimes wonder why it was included. I suspect it was to juxtapose the hot and cold themes, something the designers expanded upon in Banjo-Tooie. At the very least, it smooths out the connection between worlds, sort of like the musical transitions we discussed last time. Part of the joy of the themed worlds of this era was not just the variety in levels or aesthetic design, it was the way the designers managed to make these incredibly disparate experiences fit together as part of a coherent gameplay experience. It was arguably a positive evolution over the overworld design, which to this day still features jarring cuts from theme to theme. Freezeezy Peak is the first level I really fell in love with back when I first played Banjo. I'm a sucker for winter-themed levels, and the Peak hits all my sweet spots. Sleigh rides, Christmas, furry animals. I had looked forward to a revisit ever since I started another playthrough, and was surprised to discover something my selective memory had conveniently forgotten: the constant threat of snowball attacks. This is a real downer on our snowy adventure, so the first thing we'll do is learn the Beak Bomb and clear these guys out. While we're doing this, we'll observe another clever but subtle design decision. Notice how the heads-up display doesn't change when we're in the air. This is a consistent theme in Banjo. The designers limit the user interface as much as possible to enable player immersion. In fact, most of the time there isn't a user interface to begin with. An aiming reticule would have made the Beak Bomb more convenient, but it also would have encouraged players to focus on the mechanics of gameplay over the more fundamental goals of exploration and adventure. Whether he's in the water, on the ground, or in the air, Banjo's heads-up display focuses single-mindedly on enabling immersion. It does this more or less by not existing. With the Sir Slushies cleared out, we can finally explore the level in peace. On our way down to Bottles, we encountered our old friend Boggy, who is in the midst of some personal problems. Let's climb up to the top of the snowman and help him out. The climb's a bit treacherous, which makes this a good opportunity to discuss the live system. The concept of limited lives comes from arcade games. They were a forcing function to get customers to put in more coins. As the gaming industry shifted its attention to home consoles, the idea of lives was brought over as well, and it continued to play a useful role. For instance, many games on the Super Nintendo, including Donkey Kong Country, the predecessor to Banjo-Kazooie, featured fixed save points instead of saving after every level. This had technical benefits because it dramatically reduced how much information had to be saved at any given time. The designer could make strong assumptions about the game state depending on the save points the player had unlocked. A live system paired nicely with this. Spacing out save points with a good understanding of how many extra lives players would collect allowed designers to precisely adjust how much tension a player would feel at any given time. This led to some really great moments, like the last level in Gloomy Gulch prior to unlocking the next Wrinkly Kong. The Nintendo 64 hardware allowed Rare a lot more flexibility in how they implemented saving, and they took full advantage of it. Banjo-Kazooie saves when the player enters or exits levels, when they quit the game, when they die. Relative to Donkey Kong Country, practically all the time. The downside is that the live system lost all of its meaning. There was still a penalty for dying, but hitting a game over screen became essentially meaningless. Heck, you see it even when you quit the game normally. There are a few moments in the climb up the snowman that can feel nerve-wracking, especially if we don't clear out the Sir Slushies. But the penalty we're focused on is the loss of our note score. We're not thinking about how many lives we have. The game implicitly encourages this line of thinking by resetting the player's life count every time they quit and re-enter the game. The last place that kind of system is going to get attention is a collectible platformer. After a long climb, we've reached the summit. It's time for our first sleigh ride. Now that Boggy's decongested, we'll take him on in a sled race. that'll require us to transform into the walrus. Banjo's animal transformations are one of its core departures from the platforming genre. Like so much else in the game, they're designed around puzzle solving and exploration. You could arguably trace this back to the original animal buddies from Donkey Kong Country. Their defining feature in that game was their utility as tools to solve specific obstacles rather than straight up upgrades like Super Mario World. Let's start by highlighting the incredible coolness of this mechanic. The feeling of standing on a mumbo pad and excitedly awaiting what you'll turn into is an experience in gaming that I've rarely replicated. I liken it to discovering shortcuts in Dark Souls. The mechanical design of each transformation is also pretty well thought out. Each solves a particularly ubiquitous problem in the surrounding level. Mumbo's Mountain is defined by its hills. The swamp is, well, a swamp. Freezeezy Peak has tons of freezing water, and Click Clock Wood requires lots of vertical platforming. The transformations act as a mini version of the see but can't do philosophy that permeates the entire game. But that's not all. A larger design decision that the transformations draw our attention to is the lack of instancing in Banjo. If you're not familiar with this concept, the easiest way to understand it is to think about MMOs, massively multiplayer online games. There might be a dungeon that every player needs to complete in order to advance to the next level, but it's difficult for hundreds or thousands of people to complete the same dungeon simultaneously. This proved to be a problem in older MMOs. In fact, one of the hallmarks of the early 2000s Korean MMOs was the vicious PvP that would occur as different groups battled over the use of particular areas. Many modern MMOs take a different approach called instancing. Instancing means that every group of players that enters a dungeon is given their own instance, or copy, of the dungeon's contents. This means everyone can complete the same area without stepping on one another's toes. Banjo makes very little use of this technique. Animal transformations, regular gameplay, even jiggy challenges occur in the same game world. This is why you can collect musical notes while you're racing Boggy. You're literally racing in the same world you were just walking around in. The jiggy challenge merely adds checkpoints for the purposes of racing. The resulting impact on player immersion is really powerful. It makes the game world feel concrete, makes it feel real. For me personally, few things break my suspension of disbelief more than instancing. Jumping into a jiggy challenge and having the entire game world change in response would be jarring. It would make me very aware that I'm playing a computer game. The funny thing is, I bet that Rare's decision not to instance was primarily due to technical limitations. It's a lot cheaper to reuse the game world instead of creating copies of it. One of the great joys in unlocking a new transformation is this lack of instancing. Players interact with the exact same world, regardless of whether they're transformed or not. This allows them to essentially re-experience the level, see it from another angle, and appreciate it even more. Waza is a great example of this. He wasn't particularly cooperative back when we were a bear, but now that we're transformed, he's happy to give us a jiggy. Waza's home contains an extra honeycomb piece, which we'll go ahead and grab now. It also contains another very interesting item, the ice key. The mystery behind this item, and Stop and Swap more generally, captivated fans back in 1998. It was a source of great excitement as we impatiently awaited the next Banjo game. I can vividly remember closely watching the credit sequence every time I beat the game, wondering whether I would discover something new about this elusive item. What made it fun was the mystery, the theorizing, the wondering, the imagining. This is why I'm not a fan of the way the remake attempts to revamp this system and turn it into something more concrete. Fortunately, the subject of this design commentary is the original game, so we don't need to worry about it. Both the last race with Boggy and the Grunty Jiggy are gated behind the running shoes, so it's time for Gobi's Valley. The valley highlights the aesthetic and thematic consistency across all of Banjo's game worlds. It's a true testament to the idea that game design, in this case the choice to use a variety of themed worlds to give players a sense of exploration and adventure, is only as good as its implementation. The appeal of Gobi's Valley goes way beyond simply exploring the game's quote-unquote hot or desert level. The world design is incredibly thoughtful. The valley is the first world to make use of invulnerable enemies, and it naturally chooses mummies to embody this idea. 2 platforming sections revolve around a transient magic carpet. It fits the theme of a desert level, while still accomplishing something unique in the gameplay. The primary NPC players interact with is a camel, and a jiggy is obtained by retrieving his water. The level is filled with Egyptian statues, a sphinx, and pyramids. Each is leveraged to build unique obstacles. For instance, the ascending roundabout design of a pyramid is a perfect match for a timed race, something that isn't done elsewhere. Timers are also used in other places to convey the sense of dangerous tombs, almost giving the impression of Tutankhamun. The aesthetic and the gameplay design work together and complement each other. It's not that one was built and the other one was subsequently jerry-rigged to fit with it. This means that they also reinforce each other. Banjo's levels are memorable because they're designed as a consistent whole, rather than an amalgam of end products from various different development teams. It's not just that Gobi's Valley is a desert world, it's the desert world, because no other level features the same expression of the game's core gameplay. We came for the running shoes, now we're gonna use them. This is the last new ability we'll learn in Banjo. Furthermore, the next 3 levels will assume that we've unlocked everything. It's worth discussing the decisions made around ability unlocks. The designers had to strike a tricky balance here. On the one hand, we discussed previously that a fundamental theme in Banjo is see but can't do. You get excited about unlocking new things because you remember the previous sections you can now revisit. On the other hand, it's a combinatorial explosion of complexity for the level designer. The more abilities and the more variation in how a player can move through the game, the harder it is for the designer to know what a player has unlocked at any given time. I'll emphasize here that my point doesn't concern the details of figuring out minimum progression. Development teams build automated tools to figure that stuff out. It would be too difficult and error-prone to do by hand, and make it impossible to balance things like note doors and jiggy requirements at the end of development. The problem is that good developers don't want to center their design on the minimum set of abilities. The reason designers include them in the first place is that they want players to use them. They think their inclusion makes the gameplay more compelling. Always having to assume the bare minimum is a pretty sizable limiting factor on level design. It means that a lot of things can't be properly used until the end of the game. That's a particularly bad problem for a game like Banjo. Certain abilities just lend themselves to certain aesthetics, but that doesn't mean the designer should be forced to place the unlock for an ability in its aesthetically most similar level. This is a surprisingly hard problem, and I think it's one of the reasons Banjo is so linear. I'd also argue it was one of the primary motivators for resetting musical notes upon world exits. By strongly encouraging players to finish levels in their entirety prior to exiting, it allowed the designers to make stronger assumptions about how much progress players had made. Rare really only truly solved this in Banjo-Tooie, and the interconnectivity in that game is a pure treasure, but that's a topic for another commentary. The last thing we'll do in the valley is grab the jiggy on the top of this snake. There's nothing to really discuss here, I just think it's cool. Before making our way to Mad Monster Mansion, we need to race Boggy again with our newly acquired running shoes. I've raced this guy dozens of times, and to this day I have no idea what the intent was behind this race. The player's speed is fixed and there are no real obstacles, it's just moving from point A to point B. Boggy also seems to arbitrarily speed up and slow down for no reason. Anyway, the reason I took us back here is because it's a good excuse to look at the original sketches for this world. It was put together early in development, hence the 2.5 dimensional perspective. We also get a glimpse of some cut content. There was a bunch more planned for the snowman's face than eventually made it in the final game. Mad Monster Mansion acts as a transition into what I'd label the third act of Banjo-Kazooie. The tutorial, Mumbo's Mountain, and Treasure Trove Cove serve as the first act. They introduce the core gameplay, teach the game's foundational abilities, and acclimate players to the intellectual property. Clanker's Cavern transitions players into the second act, where the designers fully exercise the game's fundamentals. Bubble Gloop Swamp, Freezeezy Peak, and Gobi's Valley play this role perfectly. They repeat the foundational pattern of introducing new abilities and fleshing out Grunty's Lair, all while showcasing near perfect consistency between aesthetics and gameplay. The mansion transitions players into the third act, where the designers start pushing boundaries and really see where they can go with Banjo. Complexity in level design goes way up and the difficulty spikes. Take this green jump pad on the roof of the mansion. The combination of the slippery roof and the awkward jump angle make it rather difficult to consistently land correctly. It lacks the meticulous polish that we observed back when we were ascending the snowman. This is only the beginning of a much larger theme. The mansion's level design departs from its predecessors in a number of important ways, all centered around increasing complexity. It replaces wide open space with gated areas that require strong map understanding. For instance, the pumpkin transformation requires particularly clever movement in order to gain access to the mansion's roof. A number of different areas, from the barrels in the cellar to the windows of the mansion, are not obviously accessible, a theme that's extended even further in Rusty Bucket Bay. The jiggy at the bottom of the well is intended to be completed with the pumpkin, but the designers made it easy to try as Banjo, to your own peril. Similar to previous levels, the resulting increase in difficulty is pretty gentle. However, I'd also argue that it coincides with the game's maximally expected difficulty. In other words, the point at which the designers assumed the average player would be unable or unwilling to continue improving their play. Later levels feature even more complex design, but I don't think the designers expected most players to complete them. Only 165 musical notes are required between the last 3 worlds in order to unlock the Fiery Furnace quiz, arguably the game's primary ending. It features a final cinematic and even a credit sequence. Actually beating Grunty is just an extra for particularly dedicated players. We're Banjo veterans, this doesn't necessarily matter to us, but it's still worth keeping in mind. The idea that the designers didn't expect players to complete this entire level provides a new perspective on some odd decisions in level design, like the jump pad cited previously, or the nail-biting drop from the top of the organ room. We're officially crossing into the quote-unquote optional sections of Banjo, and at times this will have a noticeable impact on our gameplay. The organ room is also a good opportunity to discuss extra honeycombs. The extra honeycomb system, like so many other systems in Banjo, reinforces the connectivity and coherence of the game world. It ties different levels together and makes players feel like they're making meaningful progress in the grand scheme of things. Like secondary collectibles, they also provide additional depth to worlds and give the level designers more flexibility in what sections they build out. What makes them unique is their subtle importance. Up to this point, players haven't really feared for their lives. We've faced a few treacherous situations, sure, but nothing like the slow grind of the mansion. Taking a hit here, falling in the poison there, jumping on the vines by accident. In some ways, I've always viewed this level as a bit of a brawl, which makes the extra honeycombs all that more important. We'll continue to see this as we go forward. In particular, Cluck Clock Wood's impressive size makes extra health even more critical. I can't imagine what it would be like to reach this point of the game without having collected extra honeycombs. In fact, the linear design of Banjo and its outsized emphasis on building on ideas discovered previously really makes me wonder what the designers expected frustrated players to do. Skipping early out of the mansion because it's too hard would lead you to Rusty Bucket Bay, arguably the game's most punishing level. Players are so close to reaching the game's conclusion, but if they haven't done the work previously to expand their energy bar, then they might find it too difficult to continue. Viewing the game from this angle gave me an interesting perspective on the overworld design decisions over in Banjo-Tooie. I'm probably not the only Banjo player who appreciated the original game's emphasis on clearing worlds one by one, but I wonder if that approach backfired on some more casual players. The sequel emphasized interconnectivity and backtracking, traditionally inclusions targeted at a more hardcore audience. But from this perspective, we'd actually start to view them as the opposite, as mechanics that are intended to help newer players, not veterans. Anyway, this is mostly conjecture, I just thought it was interesting. The last thing we need to do is unlock Rusty Bucket Bay. This will require us to execute a number of transformations in order to raise the water level. While we're doing this, it's a good opportunity to discuss the overall design of Grunty's Lair. We've discussed Banjo's see but can't do philosophy ad nauseum, and Grunty's Lair is a prime example of executing on it perfectly. However, it's this later part of the game, where everything is more or less unlocked, where the hub world design kinda starts to show its cracks. The lair itself is essentially a straight line from beginning to end, with minor branches serving as entrances to different worlds. The cauldron system tries to solve this by creating shortcuts, but it's undone by its lack of logical consistency. There's no rhyme or reason to the placement of cauldrons, and it's hard to remember the ones that are connected. I'd argue that Rare didn't fully solve this problem until Nuts and Bolts, with the tight and interconnected design of Showdown Town. Alrighty, this feels like a good time to stop. Next time, we'll be visiting Rusty Bucket Bay. Thanks for watching! If you enjoyed this video, please consider following me here or on Twitter and Facebook to receive regular content updates. The relevant links are in the description below. All the best, and see you next time.